Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something really important, breast disorders. We're aiming to, pull out the key clinical information you need for coordinated patient care.
Yeah, it's definitely a complex area.
Hmm.
And the idea is to look at it through lenses like cellular regulation, infection, and pain. We'll be using breast cancer mostly as our main exemplar here.
Right. And the goal isn't just listing facts, right? It's about getting the clinical insights, the why behind assessments, risks, management, basically giving you a really solid roadmap for quality care. Okay, so let's dive into this. I mean, breast changes, they're pretty common, right? The sources say over 1 million women a year experience non-cancerous changes. But how do we sort through them? Differentiate the annoying stuff from the really risky things.
Exactly. That's where benign breast disorders, or BBDs, come in.
Yeah.
It's really about how the cells are behaving. Are they growing, proliferating? And if so, are they looking abnormal? Is there atypia?
So there's like a spectrum of risk. What's on the higher end, even if it's technically benign?
Good question. That'd be atypical hyperplasia, or AH. This is a proliferative disorder, so cells are growing, and it has atypia. They look abnormal.
Ah, okay. So the cells are growing and look weird.
Precisely. It's not cancer yet, but it really bumps up that lifetime risk significantly. It acts as, a future risk multiplier. So the management gets more intense, twice yearly exams, yearly mammograms, and talking seriously about stopping things like oral contraceptives or HRT.
Wait, okay, so you have this high-risk thing, AH, that might not even cause major symptoms, and then you have something like fibrocystic changes, FCCs. They sound awful symptom-wise, but the sources say they carry no extra cancer risk. Is that right?
That's exactly right. It's a crucial contrast. FCCs are super common, non-proliferative. The thinking is it's probably just an imbalance in the normal estrogen to progesterone ratio. This affects the lobules, ducts, tissues, leads to fibrosis, that lumpiness, and cysts, fluid-filled spaces.
And the really wild part is that even though FCCs affect maybe half of all women, cause that cyclic pain, tenderness, lumps before menstruation, they don't increase cancer risk.
Correct. The focus here is totally on managing symptoms, not heightened surveillance like with AH.
So what does that symptom management look like?
It's generally pretty straightforward. Supportive things like a good supportive bra, maybe even wear it to bed if it helps. Limiting salt and caffeine can make a difference for some. Analgesics for pain, obviously.
Okay.
But if the symptoms are really severe and hormonal drugs get considered, like OCs or SERMs, there's a big drug alert we need to mention. These carry real risks. Think thrombotic events, clots, and even uterine cancer with some. So it's not a decision taken lightly.
Got it. Okay, what about other common benign things? Sometimes you hear about masses feeling like marbles.
Ah, yeah, that often points to a fibroadenoma. This one is proliferative. There's growth, but without atypia. So the cells look normal. That's common in younger women, maybe 20s, 30s.
And how does it feel?
Typically, it's a very well-defined oval-shaped mass. Feels kind of rubbery. And importantly, it's usually freely mobile. You can wiggle it around a bit. And the key point, generally not linked to increased cancer risk.
Okay. And we should probably briefly mention men too, gynecomastia.
Right, gynecomastia, that's just a benign ridge of glandular tissue in men, usually due to an imbalance, too much estrogen compared to androgen. First step, look at medications. Things like spironolactone can cause it, or treat underlying causes like maybe hyperthyroidism.
And infections.
Definitely need to mention mastitis. It's inflammation, often happens during lactation, but not always. It can lead to abscesses. An important point, non-lactational mastitis, the kind not related to breastfeeding, does seem to carry a slightly higher risk for developing breast cancer later on. Just a subtle cue to keep in mind.
Good point. Lastly, before we move to cancer, cosmetic surgery, augmentation, for instance, anything specific for follow-up?
Yeah, a couple of things. Post-op, expect soreness, swelling for maybe 3 or 4 weeks. Raising arms might be tough initially, but the really critical long-term piece is for screening and action alert here. Mammograms need special views, called implant displacement views, to see the breast tissue properly. And patients should be aware there's a very slight, rare risk of something called BIA-ALCL. It's a type of non-Hodgkin lymphoma associated with implants. Rare, but needs mentioning.
Okay, so shifting gears now. Moving from benign changes to impaired cellular regulation, this is obviously a huge shift in care priorities. Let's focus on cancer itself. How does it start, that single transformed cell?
Right. It typically begins in the epithelial cells lining the ducts or the lobules. Then we start classifying it based on where it started and, crucially, whether it is spread beyond its original spot. Broadly, we group them into 2 main types.
Which are?
First, you have the non-invasive type, also called in situ. This includes DCIS, which is ductal carcinoma in situ. The abnormal cells are still inside the duct. It's considered stage 0 cancer, non-invasive.
Okay.
Then there's LCIS, lobular carcinoma in situ. Now, this one's interesting. Technically, it's not considered cancer itself, but finding it means a woman has a significantly higher risk of developing invasive cancer later in either breast. So it's more of a risk marker.
Got it. So if the cells do break out of the duct or lobule, that's invasive.
Exactly. That's invasive cancer. And the most common type by far is invasive ductal carcinoma. It starts in the duct, but has grown into the surrounding breast tissue.
What are the signs, the clinical cues that might suggest a more advanced stage of invasive cancer?
Well, the mass itself might feel different. Often irregular, maybe poorly defined borders, and it feels fixed, stuck to the chest wall or skin, not mobile like a fibroadenoma.
And skin changes.
Yes, skin changes are really important. As the cancer grows, it can cause fibrosis, which pulls on the Cooper's ligaments, those ligaments that support the breast. This pulling causes skin dimpling.
Okay.
And in more advanced cases or with certain aggressive types, you might see that classic peau d'orange sign. The skin looks thickened, pitted, kind of like an orange peel. That's due to edema caused by blocked lymphatic drainage.
You mentioned aggressive types. What are the main ones we really need to be aware of?
Two stand out. Inflammatory breast cancer, or IBC. It's rare, thankfully, but very aggressive. It often doesn't present with a distinct lump. Instead, the breast might be red, swollen, warm, that diffuse erythema, and you often see that peau d'orange texture. It spreads fast.
The other.
Triple-negative breast cancer, TNBC. This means the cancer cells test negative for estrogen receptors, ER, progesterone receptors, PR, and the HER2 protein.
Why is that significant?
Because many of our best targeted therapies work by blocking those receptors. So if they're not there, the treatment options are more limited, often relying more heavily on chemotherapy. TNBC also tends to grow faster and, unfortunately, is more common in younger women, premenopausal women, and African-American women.
That brings us to risk factors. You mentioned age being the primary one, but what about things people can potentially change, the modifiable risks?
Yeah, it's good to separate them out. Non-modifiable things you can't change, like your genetics, having BRCA1 or BRCA2 mutations or family history. Also things like starting periods early or having menopause late extend estrogen exposure. But the modifiable ones are key for prevention messages. Things like obesity, especially after menopause, lack of physical activity, using combined hormone replacement therapy, estrogen plus progestin, and alcohol consumption. These are areas where lifestyle choices can make a difference.
And just quickly, for completeness, male breast cancer.
Right. Very rare. Less than 1% of all breast cancers. It usually shows up as a hard, painless lump right under the nipple areola area. The big issue here often is delay. Men might ignore it or not realize it could be cancer, so they often get diagnosed at a later stage than women.
Okay, so catching any cancer early is crucial. The sources stress this kind of three-part approach to assessment, right? Screening, mammography, clinical breast exams, and breast self-awareness.
Exactly. Now, screening guidelines, they do vary, which can be confusing. In the U.S., the American Cancer Society generally recommends annual mammograms for women aged 45 to 54, then maybe every 2 years after that, depending on risk. Canadian guidelines often start routine screening a bit later, around 50.
And clinical breast exams, CBEs, performed by a healthcare provider.
Still important. Recommended about every 3 years for women in their 20s and 30s, and then annually for women 40 and over.
And what about breast self-examination, BSE? The guidance on that seems to have shifted over the years.
It has. It's less emphasized now as a formal screening tool that reliably finds cancer early. However, the concept of breast self-awareness is still really valuable. It's about women knowing what their breasts normally look and feel like.
So they can recognize changes.
Precisely. Knowing your own normal baseline is key. So the technique they describe involves being familiar with the whole area. Lying down helps flatten the tissue. Use the pads of your 3 middle fingers, not the tips. Check with 3 different levels of pressure: light, medium, firm, to feel different depths.
And cover the whole breast.
Yes. Use a consistent pattern, like vertical strips up and down, covering the entire breast and armpit area. Also, look in the mirror with arms relaxed, then raised, checking for any visual changes like dimpling or nipple changes.
When's the best time to do that?
For women still menstruating, about 1 week after their period ends, when breasts are usually least tender or lumpy. If postmenopausal or not menstruating, just pick a consistent day each month. Now, for women we know are at high risk, maybe they have a BRCA mutation or a really strong family history, The screening is more intense.
How so?
They typically need annual mammography plus an annual breast MRI, starting at a younger age, and of course, regular clinical exams. They also discuss risk reduction options more seriously, things like prophylactic mastectomy, removing the breasts, or oophorectomy, removing the ovaries, or taking chemopreventive drugs like tamoxifen.
Okay, so if during an exam or self-awareness check a mass is found, how should nurses properly assess and document that?
There's a systematic way to do it. Think location first. Use the face of the clock analogy to describe where it is. Empty 2 o'clock position, 3 centimeters from the nipple. Then describe its characteristics, like its size, insemity, its shape or contour. Is it round, oval, irregular? Its consistency. Is it soft, firm, rubbery, hard? Is it movable, or is it fixed to the skin or underlying tissue? And always, always note any associated skin changes, dimpling, redness, pot orange, or nipple changes like retraction or discharge.
But assessment alone isn't diagnosis, right?
Absolutely not. The only definitive way to diagnose breast cancer is through a biopsy, getting a tissue sample for the pathologist to examine.
What about imaging? Mammograms, ultrasounds?
Imaging helps clarify things. Mammograms are great for screening and finding suspicious areas. Digital tomosynthesis, or 3D mammography, can give a clearer picture, especially in dense breasts. Ultrasound is really useful for distinguishing between a fluid-filled cyst, which is usually benign, and a solid mass, which needs further investigation, like a biopsy.
And once you have that biopsy result, the pathology report is key.
It's everything for guiding treatment. It tells us if it's invasive or in situ, the grade, how abnormal the cells look, and crucially, the receptor status. Is it ER positive, PR positive, HER2 positive?
Why are those so important?
Because they predict prognosis and dictate therapy. ER/PR positive cancers often have a better prognosis and can be treated with hormonal therapies. HER2 positive cancers can be targeted with specific drugs like trastuzumab, Herceptin. If it's triple negative, negative for all three, the options are different.
And what about genomic tests?
Yeah, tests like Oncotype DX or MammaPrint analyze the activity of certain genes within the tumor. They can help predict the likelihood of recurrence and, importantly, help decide if a patient with early-stage ER-positive, HER2 negative cancer is likely to benefit from adding chemotherapy to hormonal therapy. It helps personalize treatment even further.
Okay, so we have the diagnosis, the staging, the receptor status, the whole picture. What does the treatment plan typically look like, and what are the absolute must-know nursing priorities?
Treatment is super individualized, but for early-stage cancer, surgery is usually the first step.
Like lumpectomy or mastectomy?
Right. Sometimes, though, we use neoadjuvant therapy. That means giving chemotherapy before surgery.
Why do that first?
The main goal is often to shrink a larger tumor. If it shrinks enough, a woman who might have otherwise needed a mastectomy, complete breast removal, might become eligible for breast-conserving surgery, like a lumpectomy, removing just the tumor and a margin of normal tissue. It can really impact surgical options. After surgery, especially if lymph nodes were removed or radiated, we get into a really crucial area for nursing: post-operative care and long-term management, particularly concerning the affected arm.
This is where that major safety priority comes in.
Yes, absolutely. Preventing trauma and infection in the arm on the site of the surgery is paramount. This is all about reducing the risk of lymphedema.
Remind us what lymphedema is.
It's a chronic swelling caused by a buildup of protein-rich fluid. It happens when the lymphatic system is damaged or blocked, which can occur after lymph node removal or radiation. It can be uncomfortable, increase infection risk, and impact quality of life.
So that action alert about the arm, it's critical.
Non-negotiable. Never allow blood pressure measurements, injections, or blood draws on the affected arm. Lifelong precaution. Immediately post-op, nursing care involves elevating the head of the bed, maybe 30 degrees, and keeping that affected arm elevated on a pillow. This helps gravity assist lymphatic fluid return and minimize initial swelling.
And the teaching for the patient about lymphedema prevention is lifelong, too.
Absolutely. It's a major focus of discharge teaching and ongoing care. Patients need to understand they have to protect that arm. Avoid cuts, scrapes, burns, maybe wear gloves for gardening or cooking. Avoid tight jewelry or clothing on that arm. And they need to know the signs report any feeling of heaviness, aching, tightness, or visible swelling right away. Early intervention for lymphedema makes a big difference.
Okay, beyond surgery, what about other treatments? Adjuvant therapy.
Right. Adjuvant therapy is treatment given after surgery to kill any remaining cancer cells and reduce the risk of recurrence. This often includes radiation therapy, especially after a lumpectomy.
How is radiation delivered?
Traditionally, it's whole breast radiation over several weeks. But there are accelerated options too, like partial breast irradiation, PBI. This could be brachytherapy, where radioactive seeds are temporarily placed inside the breast tissue for about 5 days, or even intraoperative radiation therapy, where a single dose is given during the surgery itself. And then there's systemic drug therapy, which travels throughout the body.
Tailored to those receptor results we talked about.
Exactly. Chemotherapy might be used, especially for more aggressive cancers or if lymph nodes are involved. And there's a really important action alert related to certain chemo drugs like doxorubicin and the targeted therapy trastuzumab, Herceptin.
What's the alert?
Cardiotoxicity. These drugs can potentially damage the heart muscle. So patients receiving them need regular cardiac function tests, like echocardiograms, before, during, and after treatment. And they absolutely must report symptoms like new shortness of breath, unusual fatigue, ankle swelling, or inability to tolerate usual activity levels. We have to monitor the heart closely.
And for ER-positive tumors, hormonal therapy is key.
Yes, also called endocrine therapy. For pre- or post-menopausal women, SERMs, selective estrogen receptor modulators like tamoxifen, are common. They block estrogen from binding to cancer cells, but they have risks too, like a small increased risk of blood clots and endometrial cancer.
And for postmenopausal women.
Aromatase inhibitors, or AIs drugs like anastrozole or letrozole, are often used. They work differently. They actually reduce the body's overall estrogen production. The main side effect or risk here is bone density loss, potentially leading to osteoporosis or fractures. So monitoring bone health, encouraging calcium, vitamin D, and weight-bearing exercise is important.
This is so much to process physically. What about the emotional and psychosocial impact?
Huge. A cancer diagnosis is incredibly distressing. Nurses play a vital role in assessing coping, anxiety, depression. Body image concerns are common, especially after surgery. Sexuality can be affected by treatment side effects or emotional factors. We need to create a safe space for patients to talk about these things.
Are there resources to help?
Definitely. Connecting patients with support groups or peer support programs like the American Cancer Society's Reach and Recovery Program can be invaluable. Talking to someone who's been through a similar experience makes a huge difference, and that care coordination extends right through discharge. Key teaching includes managing surgical drains that usually come out when drainage is low, less than maybe 30 milliliters per day for a few days. Also, guiding patients on gradually increasing arm exercises, starting gently maybe a week post-op to regain range of motion, and reinforcing all those lymphedema precautions again, #tag outro. So if we try to synthesize the key takeaways from this deep dive, I think first it's understanding that distinction in benign disorders, the high risk but low symptom ones like AH versus the high symptom but low risk ones like FCCs. Early detection really relies on that combined approach: mammography, clinical exams, self-awareness.
And then treatment is incredibly personalized, driven by that receptor status and stage. From a nursing standpoint, those safety priorities around preventing lymphedema and infection are just critical, alongside providing that really essential psychosocial support.
And, thinking about what we discussed, the sources highlight these disparities: higher risks, sometimes worse outcomes, more aggressive cancers like TNBC being more common in African American women and in younger women. It really brings up a crucial question, doesn't it? If care is so individualized, how do we as nurses and as a healthcare system ensure that our interventions are truly culturally competent and targeted enough to actively close those gaps? How do we make sure we're improving outcomes equitably for everyone? It's definitely something to keep wrestling with in our practice. Thank you for joining us today as we work through these really vital concepts of care for patients with breast disorders. We hope this deep dive brought some clarity and clinical focus for you.